In 1836, Texas declared independence from Mexico. Most believed that the young republic would quickly be annexed by the United States. But with the U.S. unwilling to provoke war with Mexico, at least immediately, Texas remained its own sovereign country for nearly a decade. Despite receiving recognition from France, the UK, and the United States during this time, the budding Texas government had little money, few resources, and numerous aggressors. To the south, Mexico refused to accept Texas sovereignty, and skirmishes along the border continued. But a more terrifying danger came from the north. The frontier was constantly under assault by the most brutal and dangerous group of Native Americans on the continent, the Comanche. They refer to themselves as the Numina, meaning the people. But the term Comanche is a fitting one. It is derived from the Ute language. It means anyone who wants to fight me all the time, or simply enemy. The Comanche raided Texas with impunity. They slaughtered men, stole cattle and supplies, and they routinely captured women and children. The frontier Indian depredations, coupled with Mexican aggression, required Texans to act. With enemies to all sides of the Gulf, they assigned ranging companies to defend themselves and the innocent of Texas. These rangers were meant to be the solution to attacks from bandits, Mexicans, and hostile nations such as the Comanche. But they were not that solution, at least not immediately. Superior horsemen and warriors, the Comanche made short work of inexperienced rangers, with riding skills that paled in comparison to those of the horse tribes. Additionally, the Texans' slow-firing muzzleloaders were no match for Comanche bows that could launch 20 arrows a minute. Unsafe and in debt, Texas was in real danger of becoming a failed state. However, two men would even the playing field for Texas. Perhaps the greatest Texas Ranger in history, Jack Coffee Hayes, and a firearms inventor, Samuel Colt. Welcome to Dates and Dead Guys. Jack Coffee Hayes was born in Cedar Lick, Tennessee in 1817. Son to a strict veteran of the War of 1812 and brother to a future brigadier general of the Confederate Army, Hayes was likely raised to admire the patriotism and vitriol of then-President Andrew Jackson. Warfare and conviction ran in Hayes' blood, which no doubt led him to the new Republic of Texas in 1838. Initially, Hayes picked up work as a surveyor in San Antonio, a job that came with great danger. Surveying is how the West expanded along the frontier. Settlers were given head rights or property in order to come settle in a territory. Not shockingly, the current inhabitants, those who had called the land their home for generations, despised these surveyors. The southernmost band of the Comanche, the Panatica, went out of their way to kill those that were giving away what was theirs. In 1838, more than half of the working surveyors were killed. Meanwhile, Hayes surveyed 76 head rights in his initial year, an impressive number, considering the conditions and the threat of the Comanche. Due to obvious dangers, surveyors had to be armed and often worked with military escort. Therefore, many surveyors effectively had the additional role of frontier patrolmen, if they had any intention of survival. But even as a mere surveyor, it was apparent from the start that Hayes was different from many of his peers. Not only did he tend to defeat small raiding parties of Indian attackers, but he built a reputation for keeping men alive with contagious courage and willingness to confront the war parties, saddled and head-on. While others would seek cover, Hayes stood strong, and the raiding war parties learned that there would be cost to attacking anywhere he was present. He gave to the Comanche what the Comanche gave his peers: fear. And to no one's surprise, that brashness caught the attention of the Texas Rangers. In the 1830s and 40s, most Texas Rangers were in their early 20s. Jack Hayes was no different, at that time just around 20 years old when he signed his first commission with the Rangers. The Rangers were first conceived in 1823 by Stephen F. Austin, far before Texas was independent from Mexico. With the formation of the Republic of Texas, the organization was formally constituted and was developed to protect the frontier from the Comanche and other threats. Rangers signed up for brief enlistments that usually lasted between 3 and 6 months. They were not paid well, and sometimes, due to lack of government funds, they were not paid at all. But for the Texans, this was immensely important work, as they gave some comfort to those who faced violence from all directions. With threats from bandits, Mexicans, and Indians, these were very legitimate Old West days. In 1839, Hayes, now a Texas Ranger, was present on the first large punitive expedition that was mounted to seek retribution for Comanche raids. Colonel John H. Moore, a name made famous in the Texas Revolution, raised a mounted force to travel along the lower Colorado. It consisted of 63 Rangers and 16 Lipan Apache, with the goal being to find a Comanche village for a retaliatory strike. However, the operation was a disaster. Moore's party discovered the Comanche unguarded at night in their village. They attacked on foot, but failed to run off the Comanche horses. In the chaos, the warriors quickly mounted and stampeded the Texan horses. This blunder forced Moore into a panicked retreat to a cedar break despite having the initial element of surprise. Every Texan knew that meeting the Comanche in open combat was a death sentence. While Texas long rifles had a better range than Comanche arrows, a mounted Comanche could quickly close the distance and fire off several arrows while soldiers fumbled to reload amidst a cacophony of gunshots, war whoops, and the screams of their comrades. Therefore, the standard tactic for the Texans was to take cover and keep the fast-mounted Comanche at a distance with rifles until they lost interest and left. This is perhaps what Moore had hoped to do in his retreat to the Cedar Break, which did eventually happen, but it gave little cause for celebration. Marching home from the failed expedition, Hayes contemplated how traditional military tactics were ineffective against the Comanche. On horseback, the natives were too fast and skilled with deadly bows and arrows. If they wanted to win, Hayes knew that he would have to change the way the Texas Rangers fought. 3 years before Hayes' birth, Samuel Colt was born in 1814 and would experience profound grief throughout his childhood. His mother died of tuberculosis before his 7th birthday, and he would lose all 3 of his sisters. He seemed to deal with grief by fostering a love of pyrotechnics and making things, well, explode. Not surprisingly, this developed into a passion for weaponry, and more specifically, improving firearms. In 1836, 22-year-old Colt took out a patent on a new type of firearm, one that would not need to be immediately reloaded. Guns at the time, even pistols, were all single shot. By the 1830s, gun technology had improved significantly since the time of smoothbore muskets. However, the process to reload, even the adored Kentucky rifle, took 30 seconds to a minute even for a well-trained soldier. While repeating firearms did exist, most volley guns and pepper boxes merely repeated the heavy firing mechanism. Many were cumbersome and worse, just plain dangerous to use. Colt's invention, the Colt Patterson revolver, had a couple models. The most notable being a 5-shot, 36 caliber cylinder loaded with about a 20-grain powder charge. At 36 caliber, the fragile firearm's stopping power was non-existent, and to be accurate, the target had to be close, a scenario few wanted to be in, especially against the Comanche. The only true advantage was firing rate. The first design required preloaded cylinders that could not be reloaded in the field after those rounds were fired. Because of that, people didn't see a lot of practical use in the guns. It was a virtual failure. Almost no one bought it. That is, except for Texas. In 1839, President of Texas, Mirabeau Lamar, ordered 180 Colt revolvers for the Texas Navy. They would sit unused until the short-lived Texas Navy was disbanded. Colt's revolvers, however, would find themselves in the plains of Texas, where they were of great value in the ability to sustain fire on the enemy. In 1843, Hayes was just 26. In the years since we left him, he continued to work with both the ranging companies and as a surveyor. Despite the disaster of Moore's expedition, Hayes maintained the reputation for being the best Indian fighter in the region and the uncanny ability to bring men home safely. He had been promoted to the captain of the Rangers in San Antonio, which came with better pay, but maintained the same 2-year life expectancy, a statistic that Hayes immediately desired to change. Up until this point, Rangers always had to supply their own equipment, guns, and horses. Under Hayes' leadership, the state would now provide powder and ammunition, and sometimes a stipend for supplies and food. Additionally, Hayes required his men to be expert riders, and more so, he wouldn't take anyone who didn't have a horse worth at least $100. They needed horses that could compete against Comanche Mustangs, perhaps the fastest horses in the world over short distances. Most of all, Hayes relied on tactics that mirrored the guerrilla fighting of the Comanche. The men traveled lightly, hit hard, and escaped. While these changes improved Ranger odds, there was one final addition to their arsenal: Samuel Colt's revolver. There's a bit of a mystery around how and when Jack Hays and the Rangers first got their hands on the defunct Texas Navy's Colt revolvers. But it possibly could have been under the order of its own president, the famous Remember the Alamo, Samuel Houston. In Empire of the Summer Moon, historian and author S.C. Gwynn writes how, quote, "The Rangers immediately grasped the significance of such weapons. To them, Colt's contraption was a revelation, a multi-shot weapon that could be used from horseback and thus, at long last, even the odds. Though there is no record of it, Hays and his men must have spent long hours practicing with the new weapons and figuring out what they could do. And they must have spent many nights around the campfire discussing the revolver's strengths and weaknesses." End quote. Prior to procuring the Colt revolvers, we know that Hays made his men shoot while riding horses. They drilled charging the Comanche and exchanging weapons to maintain sustained fire. These were practical adaptations to fight the Comanche. Now, with a firing rate that could match a bow and arrow, they could maybe even meet them on the dangerous open plains. All that was left was for the Colts to be tested in the field, and the opportunity arrived in the summer of 1844. That May, Hays and his men rode north to seek out bands of Comanche war parties. These bands would harass the small towns and settlements on the frontier, doing unspeakable carnage to the citizens before galloping off to safety in true Comancheria. For 3 weeks, they searched for signs of Indians, but found none. They briefly stopped a little northwest of San Antonio. Hays' company found a beehive and decided they would spend the time and effort to extract honey. As they bumbled for the honey, one of the men spotted a line of over 20 mounted Comanche at the top of a hill, a couple hundred yards in the distance. The Comanche had found them. "Indians!" shouted Ranger John Coleman. The Rangers quickly organized, mounted their horses, and climbed an adjacent slope. They were surprised, but confident in their advantage and eager for a fight. Hays, in his typical aggressiveness, ordered his men to charge the war party. They urged their galloping horses toward the high point of the Comanche line, but when the warriors didn't budge at their brashness, Hays immediately knew something was off. The Comanche always preferred to fight on their own terms, usually by surprise using overwhelming force. As the Rangers arrived within 60 yards, cresting the hill toward the warriors, they could see 2 additional lines of mounted Comanche behind the first, who had been hidden by the terrain. It was a trap. There were around 75 Comanche now facing Hays' Ranger company of only 15 men. Overwhelmingly outnumbered, Hays ordered an immediate halt and gestured to a timber line a few hundred yards away that they could use for cover. It must have bothered Hays to rely on tactics that he himself deemed archaic, but he had few options, being so heavily outmanned. This is what the Comanche were waiting for. As the Rangers turned their mounts and galloped toward the cover, the Comanche let out a war whoop and took off after them. The Comanche Mustangs slowly closed the distance on the Rangers, while additional lines of Comanche moved to flank Hays. Arrows rained from the sky as Hays' men entered the tree line and returned fire on the advancing Comanche. In typical fashion, the Comanche circled on their horses, darting in and out of rifle range before wheeling off and back into their formation. Occasionally, Ranger shots knocked warriors from their horses, but the Comanche quickly retrieved their killed or wounded from behind buffalo skin shields and maintained their siege. These casualties did little to faze the Comanche. They knew that with enough time, the Rangers' rifle fire would fail them. Unable to consistently reload their rifles, the Rangers drew their revolvers. The sudden constant gunfire confused the Comanche, and several warriors were killed who were used to exploiting the typical long pauses between shots. Still, Colt's revolver was relatively ineffective at this range. After some time, the Comanche regrouped, and Hays took the opportunity to charge them in hopes of scattering their ranks. Assembling some men, they rode out into an immediate shower of arrows. 3 of his men were hit. Others had to leave the fight in order to protect the fallen. Hays and 9 of the other Rangers were able to burst through the Comanche lines, but the Comanche continued to fight, and his horse-mounted charge proved ill-fated. Unable to get the Comanche to flee, Hays motioned his men to retreat. Samuel Walker, a Ranger whose legacy later would be entwined with the Colt, nearly died in the failed advance, taking a lance through the torso. Hays was lucky to not have lost them all. With 5 Rangers wounded, Hays' men were trapped in the trees, struggling to pull the arrows out of their bodies with the Comanche horde just outside their range. Hays relived Moore's doomed expedition in 1839. Looking down, he could see 2 Colt revolvers, which on this expedition were standard for each ranger to carry. Each 5-shot gun had 2 preloaded cylinders, meaning that each man had possibly 20 rounds that could be fired in quick succession. Hayes was a Comanche killer, and knowing that his last advance had inflicted some damage prior to retreat, he made the call to do the unexpected. He ordered his men to remount and charge the Comanche again. 7 Rangers joined Hayes and galloped from the tree line at the surviving Comanche. Not expecting subsequent brash attacks, most of the Comanche were tending to their wounded and dead. As the Rangers closed distance, Hayes yelled to his men, "Crowd them! Powder burn them, boys!" While the Colts were not accurate at long ranges, the endless gunfire from such few men frazzled the Comanche, who immediately retreated. It was clear to the Comanche that this skirmish had not gone the way it was intended. Hayes pursued the fleeing Comanche over 2 miles. The war chief desperately tried to rally his warriors to overtake the small group, but every time the Comanche wheeled to attack, the Colt claimed another warrior at close range. The Comanche certainly felt increasing puzzlement at the ability of the Rangers to shoot over and over and over again. For about an hour over rough terrain, the Rangers maintained their pursuit, determined to instill fear that the surviving Comanches would share. However, while they started with plenty of ammunition, it did run out, and the Comanche were smart enough to realize when the pause between thunder lengthened and eventually quieted. The silence shattered the illusion of the unstoppable firearm. Understanding this, the chief, with roughly 30 remaining warriors, turned to face the Rangers. Desperate, Hayes called out to see if anyone had any more ammunition. One Ranger did, Robert Gillespie. Gillespie dismounted and at a range of 30 yards dropped the chief from his horse, proving the rifle still had a place in the Texas arsenal beside the Colt. With the death of their chief, the remaining warriors scattered as their medicine, their spiritual protection, was broken with their fallen leadership. Hayes and the Rangers were lucky to be alive, but the Colt proved that they could become more than even against the Comanches on the plains. Accounts vary on casualties at the Battle of Walker's Creek, but anywhere between 20 to 50 of the 75 Comanche were killed or wounded. And out of the 15 Rangers, 8 were injured, 4 significantly, but only 1 of them died. It was a bloodbath, something that the Comanche were not ready for, and something that their small population could not withstand permanently. Reports from years later quote the Comanche as having said that the Rangers had a shot for every finger on the hand, which was actually a pretty accurate assessment. After the Battle of Walker's Creek, Samuel Colt heard about his guns proving valuable in Texas. He reached out to Samuel Walker in an attempt to reach Jack Hayes, but Walker and Colt developed a partnership of their own after Walker suggested improvements that could make the weapon more effective. Colt's technical expertise and Walker's field experience led to the creation of the now famous Colt Walker revolver in 1846. Boasting 6 larger caliber rounds and a more durable frame, that gun was a huge commercial success. And for Texas, they purchased 1,000 for the Rangers at $25 apiece, which is approximately $800 each in today's money. Quite an investment, but a necessary one for the Rangers to hold the line. With Colt Walker revolvers in hand, the Texas Rangers would now be prepared to turn the tide against the Comanche or Mexico, with arguably the most impressive personal firearm invented by man up until that point. Jack "Coffee" Hayes, Samuel Colt, in the Battle of Walker's Creek changed the history of the West, and perhaps the fate of the Comanche. The change can be summed up by the classic gunmaker slogan, "God did not make every man equal. Samuel Colt did." Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like or subscribe or comment on the channel. The Comanche series I've been working on is almost coming to an end, so if you have any suggestions on what I should take a look at next, please leave that in the comments. In the meantime, if you want to support me, take a look at one of these other videos. I'm also going to drop a Patreon soon. It's probably going to be pretty basic at first, but I want to add different tiers and extras so you guys can get more content. Thanks again for watching, and the next one will be coming soon.